I booked it on a Tuesday night while eating leftover pasta at my kitchen counter. 3 nights in Nashville, solo trip. I had a show to catch and I didn't want to spend $200 a night on a hotel for a city I wasn't even sure I liked yet. The listing came up fourth in the search results. 47 reviews. Superhost badge. A little yellow banner that said, "Rare find. This place gets booked fast." I read maybe 6 of the reviews, all 5 stars, all saying things like, "Great location," and "very clean," and "host was super responsive." I clicked confirm without finishing the pasta. That's the part one keep coming back to. 6 reviews. Out of 47. I read 6. The apartment itself was on the 2nd floor of a converted Victorian in East Nashville, the kind of neighborhood that used to be rough and is now full of coffee shops with exposed brick and $14 cocktails. The key was in a lockbox on the door. The host had sent me the code 2 hours before arrival. Efficient, impersonal, exactly what you want. I didn't meet him. I didn't speak to him. I just punched in 4 digits, walked inside, and dropped my bag on the floor. The place looked exactly like the photos. That's its own kind of reassurance when a place looks like the photos. It had that particular aesthetic that short-term rentals all seem to converge on. Floating shelves with succulents, a throw blanket draped precisely over the arm of a leather couch, a little chalkboard sign in the kitchen that said "Good vibes only." Clean. Functional. The kind of space that looks lived in without any evidence of an actual life. I told myself it was perfectly fine. I changed my shirt, went to the show, came back around midnight, and fell asleep with my shoes still on. Day 2 was normal. I walked around, ate a lot, went back to the venue for the afternoon set. I was back at the apartment by 9. I made tea. I watched something on my laptop. I brushed my teeth. That's when I first noticed it. The bathroom mirror was one of those large frameless rectangles, the kind that just seems to float on the wall above the sink. Sleek. Modern. I'd looked at it twice a day without a second thought. But that night, rinsing my face, I happened to drag the back of my hand along the bottom edge, and it shifted. Just slightly. A millimeter, maybe 2. Like a door that isn't quite latched. I stepped back and looked at it. The left side of the mirror had a gap. Thin enough that you'd never see it walking past, but visible now that I was looking for it. A dark sliver of separation between the glass and the wall. I reached up and pressed the corner gently with 2 fingers. It flexed. Not a lot. Not dramatically. But mirrors don't flex. Mirrors mounted to walls with proper hardware don't move when you press them. This one moved like something was behind it that wasn't drywall. I stood there for a while, dripping water onto the tile, telling myself to be rational. Old building. Poor installation. The wall had probably settled and the mounting had loosened. I'd stayed in 100 places with crooked pictures and draft doors and light switches that didn't work. This was nothing. I was tired and slightly on edge in an unfamiliar place, and I was turning a loose mirror mount into a reason to be afraid. I turned the light off and went to bed. I didn't sleep. Not because of anything dramatic, no sounds, no footsteps, nothing cinematic. I just lay there in the dark with the specific kind of wakefulness that comes when your brain has clocked something it can't resolve. Around 2 a.m. I got up, got a glass of water, stood in the kitchen for a while staring at the good vibes only sign, and eventually went back to bed. In the morning, with daylight coming through the blinds and the discomfort of the night reduced to something that felt almost embarrassing, I made a decision. I was going to look behind the mirror. Not because I thought I'd find anything. Because I needed to confirm there was nothing there so I could stop thinking about it. I went into the bathroom. I gripped the left side of the mirror with both hands. It was about 2 feet wide and maybe 3 feet tall, not light, and I pulled it gently away from the wall. Came away easily. No resistance. No hardware holding it flush. It was resting on 2 small wall hooks, balanced there like a painting you haven't had time to hang properly. Behind it, there was a hole in the drywall. Clean-edged, deliberate, roughly the size of a tennis ball. And inside that hole, secured with a mounting screw driven directly into the stud, was a camera. Not a large one. That was the thing that struck me first, how small it was. Black housing, maybe the size of a large marble, with a lens no bigger than a pencil eraser pointing straight out through the hole. Straight into the bathroom. Aimed directly at the sink. directly at the shower, covering everything. A small LED on the side was dark. I don't know what that meant. I don't know if it was recording to a local card or streaming somewhere or had run out of battery or had never been active at all. I don't know any of that. I stood there with the mirror in my hands and I looked at that lens and it looked back at me and I understood, in a way that wasn't abstract at all, that this had been here before I arrived and that I had undressed in this bathroom and that whatever the camera had or hadn't captured was completely outside my control. Here's what I did, and I want to be specific about this because it matters. I did not move the camera. I did not touch it. I leaned the mirror carefully back against the wall in the exact position I'd found it, walked out of the bathroom, sat on the couch and picked up my phone. I took photographs first. The gap in the mirror, the hole in the wall, the camera in the hole. I took 12 photos from different angles, making sure the mount, the screw, and the lens were all clearly visible. I sent them to my email and to 2 friends with a message that said what they were and where I was. Then I called the non-emergency police line. I filed a report. The officer I spoke to was calm and thorough and told me not to touch anything and that a detective would follow up. Then I reported it to Airbnb. I uploaded the photos directly to the report. I gave them the listing URL and the host's name and the dates of my stay. The customer service rep I reached asked me to confirm several times that I had visual evidence of the device. I confirmed it each time. Within 6 hours, the host's account had been suspended. A case ID appeared in my email. A detective called me back that evening. I checked into a hotel that afternoon. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed. A real, anonymous hotel with keycard access and no reason for anyone to know exactly which room I was in, and I felt the specific relief of being in a place where no one could see me. What I don't know is everything that happened before I arrived. 47 reviews. The camera had been there long enough to have proper mounting hardware. It wasn't a rush job. Whoever put it there had used a drill and a stud finder and a fitted lens mount. That takes planning. That takes time. That takes the assumption that no one would ever pull the mirror away from the wall. I think about the other 41 reviews I didn't read. I think about whether any of them noticed the gap and said nothing, or said something to the host privately and accepted an explanation that seemed reasonable, or simply didn't notice it at all. I think about whether any of them were in that bathroom at 2 a.m. while something recorded them. I can't answer any of that. The detective called me twice after that first conversation and then I stopped hearing from them. I don't know if charges were filed. I don't know what happened to the footage. Those are blanks that don't get filled in, and I've had to make a kind of peace with that even though it sits in me wrong. What I do know is what I do now every single time I check into any rental anywhere. I check the mirrors. I press all 4 edges gently to test for flex. I run my hand along the back of the frames. I check smoke detectors. There are cameras designed to look exactly like smoke detectors and you can buy them for $30 online. I check alarm clocks, picture frames, USB chargers left in wall outlets, air purifiers, anything with a small dark aperture that could house a lens. Takes me about 10 minutes. I do it in every rental every time without exception. My friends think it's paranoid. One of them said it was no way to live. I told her it wasn't paranoia after you've had a reason. She didn't have a good answer to that. The thing about this kind of violation is that it doesn't operate like a normal bad experience. You don't process it and move past it. It changes the geometry of certain spaces, bathrooms, bedrooms, anywhere you'd normally assume you were alone. There's a version of every room now where the wall is watching, and once you know that version exists, you can't fully unknow it. I still travel. I still use rentals sometimes, when the price is right and the reviews are thorough and I've done my 10-minute sweep and found nothing. But I always check the mirror. Every time. I always check the mirror. We almost didn't go to Lisbon at all. That's the part that gets me now, how close we came to booking somewhere else entirely. We'd been going back and forth between Lisbon and Porto for 2 weeks, switching our minds every other day, and it was only a last-minute price drop on a 2-bedroom apartment in Alfama that settled it. I remember feeling like it was meant to be. I remember saying those exact words out loud while I clicked confirm. We needed the trip. That part was real. My girlfriend and I had been running on empty for months. Both of us working too much, communicating too little, existing in the same apartment without really being present in it. Lisbon was supposed to be a reset. 10 days. No laptops. Eat well. Sleep properly. Remember why we liked each other. For the first few hours, it was exactly that. The apartment was beautiful in the way that only old European cities can produce. Terracotta tiles, a narrow balcony overlooking a cobblestone street, afternoon light coming through wooden shutters in long, warm strips. We dropped our bags and opened a bottle of wine we'd bought at the airport and sat on that balcony and didn't talk about work once. Felt like exhaling for the first time in months. The first message came 20 minutes after we'd checked in. Everything okay? Did you find the apartment okay? The host. I'll call him D because that was the initial he signed off with on every message. Just D like a signature. Nothing unusual about the message itself. Host check-in. We wrote back immediately, told him everything was perfect, thanked him for the instructions. He responded with a thumbs-up emoji. I put my phone face down on the table and forgot about it. At 11 p.m., my phone buzzed. Just checking, you found the extra towels in the cupboard under the sink. There are 3 sets. We had found them. I replied yes, thank you. My girlfriend raised her eyebrows at me from across the room. I shrugged. At 7:08 the next morning. Good morning. Did you sleep well? The bed. Is it comfortable for you both? I stared at that message for a moment. It was fine. It was technically fine. Hosts want good reviews, and good reviews come from guests who feel cared for. I knew that. I wrote back that we'd slept great. The bed was very comfortable. We were heading out to explore. He responded within 90 seconds. Wonderful. Which neighborhood are you thinking today? I put my phone in my pocket and didn't answer that one. By day 3, I had started keeping a rough count without meaning to, the way you start counting something when your body has registered a pattern before your brain has named it. For messages on day 2, 5 on day 3. Not about logistics. Not about the apartment. Questions about where we were eating, whether we tried a specific bakery 2 streets over that he mentioned by name, whether we'd been down to the waterfront yet, what we thought of the city so far. My girlfriend still thought I was reading too much into it. She's the more generous of the 2 of us by nature. She extends good faith the way some people extend credit, easily and often, and she kept reframing it. He's proud of his city. He wants us to have a good experience. That's not weird, that's hospitality. I wanted her to be right. I tried to let her be right. Then we came back to the apartment on the afternoon of day 4 and found the wine. It was sitting on the kitchen counter. A bottle of local Vinho Verde, the label handwritten, the kind of small production thing you'd find at a Saturday market. Next to it, a folded piece of paper. I picked it up. For you both, enjoy the city. D. He had let himself in while we were out. I stood in the kitchen holding that note and I felt the temperature of something shift inside me. Not panic. Not yet. Something colder and quieter than panic. The feeling of a boundary being crossed so smoothly that the person crossing it doesn't seem to think it's a crossing at all. I messaged him immediately. I kept it neutral. I said we'd found the wine, that it was very kind, and I asked casually, I thought, whether he'd stopped by while we were out. He responded in minutes. Yes, I hope that's okay. I was nearby and wanted to leave you something. I could see you'd been out most of the day. I read that sentence 3 times. I could see you'd been out most of the day. I wrote back and asked what he meant. He explained it easily, without any apparent awareness that the explanation was worse than the original statement. He said he'd been watching the apartment from a cafe down the street, and when he noticed we hadn't come back by early afternoon, he figured it was a good time to stop in. He had been watching the apartment from a cafe down the street. He said it like someone describing how they checked the weather before leaving the house. Just a thing he did. Just a reasonable precaution a host takes before entering a property. My girlfriend read the message over my shoulder and went very quiet. We talked about leaving that night. Seriously, practically talked about it. Looked at hotels, looked at what a cancellation would cost. Sat at that kitchen table with the wine bottle between us like an artifact from a crime scene neither of us quite wanted to name. We went back and forth. It was expensive to cancel. There were only 6 nights left. Maybe we were overreacting. Maybe the watching from a cafe thing was just a cultural difference in how people understand privacy. Maybe. We didn't leave that night. That was probably a mistake, and I've made my peace with it being a mistake. What changed was everything else. The way we moved through those 6 days was different now, lower, careful, aware of the windows in a way you shouldn't have to be aware of windows. We started leaving and returning at unpredictable times. We stopped going out on any kind of regular schedule. We kept the shutters on the street-facing side mostly closed, which meant losing that beautiful afternoon light, which felt like its own small loss on top of everything else. The messages continued. For 5 a day. We responded less. He didn't seem to notice or didn't care. He would send a message about a restaurant and follow it up 3 hours later asking if we tried it yet, then follow that up the next morning asking what we'd thought. On day 7, I stopped responding altogether. He sent 9 messages that day. Not threatening, not explicit, just relentless, each one finding some new angle of interest. The weather, a festival happening across town, a question about whether we preferred coffee or tea in the mornings because he was thinking of stocking the kitchen differently. The last message he sent on our final evening was the one I've thought about the most since. Safe travels tomorrow. It was wonderful having you here. I feel like I got to know you both quite well. We had met this man exactly once, briefly at check-in, for maybe 4 minutes while he handed over the keys and explained how the washing machine worked. For minutes of face-to-face contact over 10 days. He felt like he knew us. I reported the messages to Airbnb after we landed. All of them. I'd been screenshotting since the cafe comment and I uploaded everything in sequence. Airbnb's resolution team contacted me within 2 days. They were thorough and, reading between the lines of their careful customer service language, I could tell this wasn't their first complaint about this listing. His account was suspended within a week. I found out later, through a travel forum where someone else had posted about him, that at least 2 other guests had reported similar experiences. The constant messages, the watching, the unannounced entries framed as kindness. One of them had come back to the apartment to find him sitting in the living room, waiting to ask if they needed anything. Here's what I want to say to anyone who reads this and recognizes the early stages of what I'm describing. That first message that's 1 note too warm. That first question that's 1 beat too personal. You are not overreacting. The feeling you're naming before you've named it yet is a real thing your nervous system is detecting. The fact that nothing has technically happened doesn't mean nothing is wrong. We spent 4 of those 10 days managing our behavior around a person who had no right to that kind of influence over us. We closed the shutters. We randomized our schedule. We ate dinner early because it felt safer than being out after dark. We did all of that in a city we'd saved up to visit, in an apartment we were paying for, because one person decided that access to our home meant access to us. The trip was still beautiful, in the ways that Lisbon is always beautiful, the light, the food, the trams grinding up hills at dusk. But there's a layer over the whole memory now that I can't peel back. Every photograph from that trip has him in it somewhere, even when he's not in the frame. That's what I mean when I say it doesn't end when you check out. We still talk about going back to Lisbon someday. We want to do the trip again, properly, without that layer over it. We just haven't booked it yet. The house was exactly what the listing promised, which should have been enough. A 3-story Victorian in Portland, the kind of building that has its own personality before you even step inside. Painted sage green with original corbels along the roofline, a covered porch with 2 rocking chairs that nobody actually used, tall narrow windows that turned the late afternoon light amber as it came through. The listing photos had been taken in summer and the place looked luminous in them. I booked it in November. The light was different in November, lower and grayer, and the house looked different in it too, still beautiful but in a way that had some weight behind it. I was there for a work conference. For nights, solo. My company had offered to cover a hotel, but I'd argued for the difference in cost and pocketed the gap, which is something I'd done a dozen times before without incident. The host, a woman I'll call the owner throughout this because she never gave me a name to use, just a check-in code and a list of house rules in a laminated sheet, lived on the ground floor. Guests had the upper 2 floors. The arrangement was clear. I would have the run of everything above the first landing. I dropped my bag in the main bedroom on the 2nd floor, which was large and well-furnished and had a window seat overlooking the backyard. Good bones, my mother would have said. I walked the 2nd floor first, the way I always do in unfamiliar spaces. A habit more than a plan, just getting a sense of the layout. 2 bedrooms. A shared bathroom. A small sitting room with a reading chair and a lamp that gave off warm yellow light. At the end of the hallway, past the sitting room, a door. painted the same color as the walls. That's why I almost missed it. Not because it was hidden exactly, but because it had been so thoroughly absorbed into the visual texture of the hallway that my eye kept moving past it. I only noticed it because I'd run out of hallway to walk, and there it was, flush with the wall trim, a handle so close and finished to the surrounding woodwork that you'd have to be looking for it to find it. I tried the handle. Locked. I noted it the way you note a thing that isn't your business and went back to unpacking. The first night passed normally. I ate dinner near the conference venue, came back late, slept well enough. The house made the sounds old houses make. The tick and settle of timber contracting in the cold, pipes somewhere deep in the walls cycling through their routines. I've stayed in enough old buildings that those sounds don't register anymore. White noise with character. The second night I woke up at 2:17 a.m. I know the time because I checked my phone, partly to orient myself. The room was unfamiliar in the dark, and partly because the sound that woke me was specific enough that I wanted to mark when it started. It was coming from behind the wall directly adjacent to the locked door. A low, dragging sound. Slow and rhythmic, not continuous. It would go for maybe 8 to 10 seconds, stop for a few, then start again. Not an animal exactly, though that was my first reach. Something more deliberate than a raccoon shifting around in a crawl space. A dragging sound has direction to it. This had direction. It moved laterally, left to right, then stopped. I lay there listening for 15 minutes. It stopped before I made any decision about what to do. The next morning I came down the stairs and found the owner in the hallway near the front door, adjusting something on the mail table. I asked her, as casually as I could manage, which probably wasn't very casual, about the locked door upstairs. She smiled. Storage, she said. Old furniture, things she hadn't gotten around to dealing with. She waved her hand in the way people wave away things they find uninteresting. I asked if anyone else was staying in the house. No, she said. Just me. She went back into her ground floor apartment and closed her door, and I stood in the hallway for a moment thinking about the sound and where it had come from and the way she'd answered both of my questions with the exact words that would end the conversation. Third night. 1:52 a.m. The same sound. If anything, slightly longer this time, 15 seconds, pause, 15 seconds again. I sat up in bed. I turned my lamp on. The sound continued for another few seconds and then stopped. Not gradually. Immediately, the way a sound stops when someone hears a response to it. I want to be careful here about what I'm claiming and what I'm not. I am not telling you I heard a person. I am telling you that the sound stopped with the specific abruptness of something that had registered a change in its environment. Those are different claims, and the difference matters. On the fourth night, I set an alarm for 1 a.m. and I sat in the hallway. I know how that reads. I know it sounds like something a person in a horror film does right before something happens to them. I want to explain why I did it, because it wasn't bravery and it wasn't stupidity. It was the particular kind of desperation that sets in when you've spent 3 nights telling yourself a rational explanation exists and the rational explanation keeps failing to satisfy you. I needed to be in the hallway. I needed to be close to the source of the thing. I needed data. I sat with my back against the wall opposite the locked door, my knees drawn up, a glass of water on the floor next to me because I didn't know how long I'd be there. The hallway was dark except for the thin strip of light coming from under the bathroom door at the far end, which I'd left on deliberately. At 1:44 a.m., the sound began. It was louder in the hallway than it had been through the bedroom wall. The same dragging quality, but with more texture to it now, like something being pulled across a rough surface, stone or unfinished concrete. Not wood. Slow. Periodic. Real. I gave it about 30 seconds and then I knocked on the door. 2 sharp knocks. I said, out loud, in a voice I kept steady by concentrating very hard on keeping it steady. Is someone in there? The sound stopped. Not faded. Stopped. And then, and this is the part I've described to maybe 5 people in the years since because it's the part one have no explanation for and no way to make sound less significant than it was. I heard footsteps. Quiet ones. The footsteps of someone making a deliberate effort not to be heard, moving away from the door into whatever space existed behind it. I did not open the door. I want to be honest about that. It was locked, yes, but the point is that even if it hadn't been locked, I don't think I would have opened it. Something in me had reached a very clear conclusion about what it wanted to do, and what it wanted to do was stand up, go back to the bedroom, push the dresser against the door, and lie awake until morning. That is exactly what I did. At checkout, I said nothing to the owner. I smiled. I thanked her for the stay. She asked if I'd slept well, and I said yes. I don't know why I lied. Some mixture of not knowing what I would actually accuse her of, and not wanting to be the person standing in a Victorian hallway in Portland trying to explain that footsteps in a locked room had scared me badly enough to push furniture against a door. I filed the report with Airbnb that afternoon. From the airport, waiting for my flight. I wrote everything out in order: the sound, the nights it occurred, the conversation with the owner, the knock, and the response. I was specific about the footsteps because I decided that if I was going to report it, I was going to report what I'd actually heard, not a tidied-up version of it. Airbnb contacted the owner. Her response came back through the platform a few days later, relayed to me in a customer service summary. The door led to a storage room containing an old HVAC unit that made noise in cold weather. Pipes and pressure and contraction. Normal old house sounds. The HVAC explanation is possible. I don't rule it out entirely. The footsteps are not an HVAC unit. I know what an HVAC unit sounds like, and I know what footsteps sound like, and they are not the same sound. But I can't prove that to anyone, and I knew it at the time, which is why I kept my voice even in the airport and wrote my report in careful, factual language and used words like appeared to be and sounded like instead of the words I actually wanted to use. What I wanted to write was, there was someone in that room. But appeared to be is the language of a person who understands that what they heard at 1:44 a.m. in a dark hallway is never going to be enough. I've looked at the listing a few times since then. Still up. Still a superhost. The photos are the same. That luminous summer light, the rocking chairs on the porch, the amber windows. The locked door isn't in any of the photos. I've looked carefully. It's never in any of the photos. The warning was there the whole time. That's the part one have to live with. Not that something happened to us. Nothing happened to us, technically. Not in the way that makes a police report straightforward or a story easy to tell. What I have to live with is that the information existed before we ever packed our bags. And I walked right past it because I was in a hurry and the photos were beautiful and 4.8 stars felt like a guarantee. It was October in Nashville. 4 of us, 2 couples, a long weekend, the kind of trip you plan in a group chat over the course of 3 months and actually execute maybe once every 2 years. We wanted a cabin. We wanted fall foliage and a fireplace and a front porch with enough chairs for all of us to sit outside at night with drinks and not talk about work. The listing delivered on every visible count. Exposed wood beams. A wraparound porch. 12 acres of private land backing up against a national forest. 31 reviews, 4.8 stars. Responses from the host on every single one. I read the most recent 8 reviews. All 5 stars. All variations of the same things. Cozy, well-stocked kitchen, beautiful views, host was great. I didn't read the ones from a year ago. I didn't read the filtered ones. I booked it in under 10 minutes and texted the group chat a link with 3 leaf emojis. We arrived on a Friday afternoon. All 4 of us in one car, someone's playlist going, a cooler in the trunk. The cabin was exactly what the photos promised, and in October light it was even better. The trees were at peak color and the air had that specific clean cold that makes you feel like your lungs are working properly for the first time in months. We unloaded the car. Someone started a fire. Someone else opened wine. By 7 o'clock we were on the porch in heavy sweaters and it felt like the trip was going to be everything we'd wanted. The host, I'll call him the caretaker, because that's how he described himself in the listing, as the property caretaker rather than the owner, had left a handwritten welcome note on the kitchen table. It was friendly enough. Directions to the nearest town, which firewood to use, a number to call if anything went wrong. He mentioned he lived about a mile up the road and was available if we needed anything. We noted it the way you note a fire extinguisher. Good to know, hopefully unnecessary. The first full day was perfect. We hiked in the morning and drove into town in the afternoon. We ate too much at a barbecue place on the main street and came back to the cabin and lit the fire again and stayed up until midnight. No messages from the caretaker. No surprises. I remember thinking specifically that I'd made a good call on this one. Saturday night, around 10 o'clock, one of us noticed the truck. We were all in the living room. The front windows faced the gravel driveway, and beyond that the access road that came down from the main road through a gap in the trees. The cabin's outdoor lights threw enough glow to see maybe 30 feet. Past that it was just darkness and the shapes of pines. The truck was parked at the top of the driveway, right at the edge of where the light reached. Not pulled in, not approaching, just sitting there, engine off, headlights dark. The kind of parking that isn't accidental. You don't roll to a stop at the exact point where a property's light ends unless you've thought about where you're stopping. One of us said, "Is that someone's car?" Nobody answered right away. We all looked at it. The truck didn't move. No one got out. There was no reason for a vehicle to be parked at the top of a private driveway at 10 o'clock on a Saturday night. Not a neighbor, not a delivery, not a lost driver, because lost drivers don't turn their headlights off. We watched it for maybe 20 minutes. I kept expecting it to either pull forward or back up and leave. Did neither. It just sat there at the edge of the light. Then the headlights came on, and it reversed slowly up the access road and disappeared into the trees. We didn't talk about it much that night. I think we all made the same unconscious decision to let the evening continue, to not be the one who said out loud what we were all thinking. Someone changed the subject. Someone refilled glasses. The fire was still going and the cabin was warm, and the alternative. Sitting in a rented cabin on 12 acres in the dark, processing the fact that someone had just spent 20 minutes watching the house, wasn't one any of us wanted to choose. I told myself it was a neighbor. Wrong driveway, maybe, or just someone who'd pulled off the road for a phone call. I told myself that 4 or 5 times before I fell asleep. Here's what we didn't know until after the trip. 3 days after we got home, one of us went back onto the listing to leave a review. She's thorough in a way the rest of us aren't. She reads the fine print, she checks the terms. She's the one in any group who actually clicks through all the pages. She found the filtered reviews. Airbnb's review system has a layer most people never reach. Reviews that have been flagged or that don't meet certain criteria get filtered to a secondary page, separated from the main display. You have to know to look for them. Most people don't. There were 4 filtered reviews on this listing. 2 of them were about the caretaker. The first was a couple from 8 months prior. They described a truck parked at the edge of the driveway one evening, sitting for a while, then leaving. They mentioned it almost as a footnote, buried in the middle of an otherwise positive review. They said they'd assumed it was a neighbor. They left 4 stars. Read that again. They saw what we saw, and they left 4 stars. The second filtered review was different in tone. A woman, solo traveler, staying about a year before us. She wrote that on her second evening the caretaker had knocked on the door unannounced. Said he needed to check on the water pressure. Her partner let him in. He spent a long time in the utility room. Then he came out and walked slowly through the kitchen. She wrote, the way someone walks through a space when they're taking inventory of it rather than passing through it. He looked at the counter, at the table, at the window. He said nothing that needed saying. He left after about 40 minutes without identifying any issue with the water pressure. She said the whole thing made her feel physically sick and she wasn't entirely sure why. I read that line maybe 6 times. Physically sick and not entirely sure why. Because I know that feeling, most people know that feeling, and it doesn't come from water pressure checks that run long. It comes from something in the body registering a threat before the mind has assembled the evidence. She left 3 stars and a note that said the cabin itself was lovely. The 4 of us sat with those reviews for a long time. We went back over the Saturday night, over the truck at the top of the driveway, over the 20 minutes of just sitting there at the edge of the light, and we re-examined all of it with the reviews underneath it like a transparency laid over a photograph. The trip read differently with that transparency in place. We reported the listing to Airbnb and submitted the filtered reviews as supporting context. We don't know what happened after that. The listing is still up. The 4.8 stars are still there. The welcome note about the caretaker living a mile up the road is probably still on the kitchen table. I think about the other people who've booked that cabin since us. The ones who read 8 reviews, the recent ones all 5 stars. The ones who texted a link with 3 leaf emojis. I think about whether they noticed the truck. But here's the thing I want to say clearly, because it's the thing I've said to every person who's heard this story and shrugged and told me nothing actually happened. Something was happening. Something was being tested or assessed or decided that night on the driveway, those 40 minutes in the kitchen, the watching from just outside the edge of the light. I don't know what the conclusion of it was for the people who experienced it. I don't know what it might have become. What I know is that two separate sets of strangers in two separate stays months apart described the same behavior. The same truck. The same stillness at the edge of the property. One of them called it unsettling and moved on. The other one said it made her physically sick. Both of them buried it in 4- and 3-star reviews. Both of them said the cabin itself was lovely. That's how these things survive. Not because nobody notices, but because we're trained to separate the experience from the place, to give the benefit of the doubt, to not be the person who ruins someone's livelihood over a feeling. We write lovely cabin, minor issue with host, and we click submit and we go home. And the listing stays up. And someone else books it. And the truck parks itself at the edge of the driveway at 10 o'clock at night. And waits. It wasn't a dramatic discovery. That's the part that's hardest to explain. There was no crash, no door swinging open, no moment where everything shifted at once. It was a Tuesday morning and I was doing something completely ordinary and I found something that had no ordinary explanation, and the gap between those two things, the mundane action and the thing it uncovered, is where all of it still lives in me. I was in Chicago for 10 days. My own apartment was being renovated and I needed somewhere to be, and a short-term rental made more financial sense than a hotel for that length of time. The place I found was a studio in Wicker Park, a neighborhood I knew well, which was part of the appeal. Same coffee shop I'd been going to for years, 3 blocks away. Familiar streets. The rental itself was compact but genuinely well-designed, the kind of space where someone had put real thought into how a small square footage could feel livable. Good light, decent kitchen, a bed that was better than my own. The host was a woman who lived in another state and managed the property remotely. All communication through the platform. Professional, efficient, nothing unusual. She had around 40 reviews and they were consistent, clean, comfortable, responsive host, easy check-in. I read most of them. I found nothing to flag. For the first 3 days I barely thought about the apartment at all except as a functional base. I worked during the day, met friends in the evenings, came back and slept and started again. The renovation on my own place was supposed to take 2 weeks and I was already thinking about what I'd do if it ran long. On day 4 I decided to reorganize my suitcase. I know how small that sounds as a sentence. I decided to reorganize my suitcase. But I'd been living out of it in a disorganized way, pulling things from the top without repacking properly, and I wanted to find a sweater I'd packed at the bottom. I carried the suitcase into the closet, which was a decent size, a walk-in, which was one of the features listed in the description, and I set it on the floor and opened it fully and started working through it from the bottom up. The closet had a built-in shelf running above the hanging rod. I put my empty duffel bag up there when I arrived and hadn't looked at it since. While I was crouching over my suitcase, I happened to look up. Just a reflex, checking the space, and I noticed something on the back wall of the shelf. Above the rod. Pushed to the far corner, up near where the shelf met the wall. Easy to miss if you were just hanging clothes and moving on. Not easy to miss if you were looking directly at it. It was a piece of paper. Folded once, tucked flat against the wall like someone had wedged it there deliberately. Like they'd wanted it to stay without being visible at eye level. I stood up and reached for it. It wasn't folded. It was a photograph. Printed on copy paper, not photo paper, just standard letter-size copy paper run through an inkjet printer, the kind of image that loses contrast and goes slightly gray at the edges. The paper had yellowed just a little at the corners. It hadn't been printed recently. The image was of this room. This specific apartment. The angle was from approximately where I was standing, from inside or just outside the closet doorway, pointing toward the bed. Daytime light in the photo, coming through the window the same way it came through now. The bedside table, the lamp, the same headboard. And in the bed, someone asleep. Lying on their side, facing away from the camera, one arm out above the covers. You couldn't see their face. You couldn't see enough to identify them. What you could see was that they were completely unaware of being photographed. That whoever had taken the photograph had been standing roughly where I was standing when I found it. and that the photograph had then been placed in a corner of a shelf inside a closet where it would not be found unless you were specifically crouching on the floor and happened to look up. I held it for a moment, then I put it back exactly where I'd found it. I'm not sure why I put it back. Something about not wanting to disturb whatever record existed. Something about the photograph feeling like evidence in a case I didn't yet understand. And evidence shouldn't be moved before it's documented. I took out my phone and photographed the shelf first, then reached up and photographed the paper in place, then took it down and photographed the image itself from multiple angles. I documented the yellowing, the printer quality, the approximate dimensions. Then I went through the closet. Every corner, every shelf bracket, every seam where the drywall met the frame. I pulled the hanging rod slightly away from the wall and checked behind it. I checked the light fixture housing, a simple bulb socket recessed into the ceiling. Nothing. No camera. No hardware. No secondary lens mounted anywhere I could reach or see. I expanded outward. Smoke detector. I stood on a chair and examined it from 6 inches away. Clean. The thermostat housing. The 2 framed prints on the bedroom wall. The gap behind the mirror above the bathroom sink. A small air purifier on the nightstand that I'd been switching on every evening without thinking twice about it. I went through all of it methodically, corner to corner. I found nothing, which somehow made it worse, because the photograph existed regardless of what I found or didn't find. It had been taken from somewhere in that apartment by someone with a camera, and then printed, and then placed in a position that suggested a specific awareness of how the space was used. Not thrown behind the dresser. Not left loose in a drawer. Placed exactly where someone might put a thing they wanted to preserve without displaying. Filed. That word kept surfacing as I stood in that closet. Felt filed. I called Airbnb from the kitchen, standing up, because I couldn't make myself sit down. The person I reached was patient and thorough, and I could tell from the quality of their listening that they understood what I was describing. I emailed the photographs while we were on the call. The case ID came through before we hung up. I messaged the host directly through the platform. Precise, factual location, appearance, content of the image, the approximate age of the paper. Her response came back in about 2 hours. She said she had never seen it. She said she was shocked and that she would take it extremely seriously. She asked if I was all right. She seemed genuine. I believe it's genuinely possible she knew nothing, that a previous owner or a contractor or someone else with access to the apartment before she took it over had placed it there, and it had simply sat in that corner of that shelf through cleaning visit after cleaning visit, year after year, waiting to be found by someone with a reason to look up. That's the version available to me. I've turned it over many times, and it remains the only version with anything under it. What I cannot resolve, what I have never been able to resolve, is the person in the photograph. Someone slept in that apartment not knowing they were being photographed. Someone was in that bed, in that specific room, and a camera was pointed at them while they slept, and afterward whoever held the camera printed the image and placed it in the closet where that same person would return the next morning to get dressed, completely unaware of what had happened while their eyes were closed. I've thought about whether it was a guest or someone who lived there before it became a rental. I've thought about what the photograph was for, proof of a visit, a record of something done, a document of something the photographer needed to remember or wanted to keep. I've thought about whether there are others. Whether somewhere there's a folder on a hard drive or a box in storage or a collection spanning years of guests, all of them asleep, all of them facing away from the lens. There's no end to that line of thinking. That's what I mean when I say this kind of discovery is different from a fear you can name. A fear with a name has edges you can trace. This one opens in every direction and none of the directions terminate. Airbnb suspended the listing pending investigation. The host reached out once more to say she had hired someone to sweep the property professionally. I appreciated that. I don't know what they found. I went home when the renovation finished. Slept in my own bed. Kept my closet door open for about 3 weeks. Not because I expected anything, just because I needed to be able to see inside it from across the room. I've stayed in rentals since. When I do, I check the standard things first. Mirrors, smoke detectors, vents, clocks. But I also check the shelf corners now. The high back walls. The places where someone could press a folded piece of paper flat and leave it for months without anyone finding it. because nobody has a reason to look up at the back of a closet shelf unless something makes them. Something made me. The photograph is in a sealed envelope in the back of a filing cabinet in my apartment. I kept it because discarding it felt wrong, like destroying something that might still matter someday to someone, even if I don't yet know who or how. I haven't looked at it since the morning I found it. I don't plan to. I almost left a 5-star review. That's the thing I keep circling back to. If I'd checked out one day earlier, if the trip had ended on Thursday instead of Friday, I probably would have written something like, "Wonderful host, beautiful cottage, highly recommend," and clicked submit without a second thought. The discomfort I felt would have stayed at the level of a vague unease I couldn't quite justify, and I would have dismissed it as social anxiety or an introvert's sensitivity to too much friendliness. It took 5 days to understand what was actually happening. By then I had 2 nights left and nowhere else I wanted to spend the money. I was in Savannah for a week in March. Solo trip. No particular agenda. I'd taken leave from work for the first time in 2 years, and I needed somewhere to go that wasn't home. Somewhere with enough character to hold my attention without requiring me to plan anything. Savannah was exactly that. The squares, the Spanish moss, the way the whole city feels like it's operating on a slightly different clock than everywhere else. I'd been twice before, and both times I'd left wanting more time. The rental was a backyard cottage behind a main house in the historic district. Detached, private, its own entrance through a wooden gate in the garden wall. The listing described it as a writer's retreat, which was accurate. It was one large room with a writing desk under the window, a daybed that converted into a proper bed, a small kitchen along one wall, and a bathroom that had been recently renovated with subway tiles and a rainfall showerhead. Charming without being precious. Exactly what I needed. The host lived in the main house at the front of the property. He was the kind of man who seemed perfectly calibrated for the role, warm without being effusive, helpful without hovering, mid-50s, the sort of unhurried quality that Savannah seems to produce in people who've lived there long enough. He showed me the cottage on arrival, explained the quirks, the key sticks, the garden hose is for the porch plants if you feel like it, help yourself to the herbs in the raised bed. He baked bread on Sundays and would leave a loaf outside my door if I was interested. I was interested. He seemed great. I told myself I'd found one of the good ones. The first small thing happened on day 2. He knocked mid-morning to drop off a jar of local honey. A neighbor kept bees, he said, and he always picked up extra. While he was handing it over, he mentioned, just in passing, that he'd seen me reading on the porch that morning. He said it with a warmth, like he was noting something that pleased him. "I saw you out there earlier with your book." Just that. I smiled and thanked him for the honey. It wasn't until he'd gone back through the garden gate that I thought about the geography. The porch faced the garden, not the main house. There was no window in the main house that had a natural sightline to my porch. The angle was wrong, the garden wall too high. To see me on the porch, he would have had to be in the garden itself. Standing in the garden, watching. I told myself he'd been tending the herbs, that he'd just happened to glance over, that I was making something out of nothing because I was alone and slightly too much inside my own head, which happens on solo trips when you don't have someone else's reactions to calibrate against. I let it go. I opened the honey. It was very good honey. Day 3, he mentioned what I'd been wearing. We passed each other near the garden gate in the early afternoon, and he said something easy and conversational about the weather. And then, "You had the blue linen shirt on this morning, didn't you? It suits you." And then he moved on like he'd commented on nothing more notable than the temperature. I stood at the garden gate for a moment after he'd gone inside. He knew the color of the shirt I'd been wearing that morning. Not a shirt I'd worn when I met him, not a shirt visible through a window. I'd been inside the cottage all morning at the writing desk, and the only window facing toward the main house was the one above that desk, and the curtains were almost fully drawn. Almost. I went back inside and looked at the window from the desk. A gap on the left side where the curtain didn't quite reach the frame. Maybe 3 inches. Enough to see a person sitting at the desk if you were standing at the right angle in the garden. Enough to see what color shirt they were wearing. I pulled the curtain the rest of the way and clipped it to the frame with a binder clip from my bag. I noticed my hands weren't entirely steady while I did it. That night he sent a message through the platform. Not unusual. We'd exchanged a few logistical ones. saying he hoped I was enjoying the cottage and that he always liked watching the light come through the garden window in the evenings, that he found it peaceful. The garden window. My window. I read that message probably 4 times. He was telling me that he watched my window in the evenings. He'd framed it as something aesthetic, something about light and peacefulness, as if that framing changed what the sentence meant. But the sentence meant, I stand in the garden at night and I look at your window. I've described this to people and they ask why I didn't just leave. It's a reasonable question. The answer is layered. The money was already spent. I didn't have evidence of anything technically wrong. And there's a specific paralysis that comes with this kind of situation where each individual thing is just explainable enough to make you doubt your own reading of it. The shirt could have been visible through the gap. The evening light comment could have been innocent. A person can stack a dozen explainable things and still feel, in the part of them that doesn't deal in explanations, that something is badly wrong. That part of me was very loud by day 4. I started moving differently inside the cottage. I kept away from the windows. I changed clothes in the bathroom. I closed the curtains on every window all the way and used my phone flashlight rather than the desk lamp in the evenings so no light would be visible from outside. I am a grown adult who paid for a private cottage, and I was living in it like I was hiding. On day 5 he knocked with a jar of homemade jam, and while I was thanking him he mentioned, with that same easy warmth, that it looked like I'd been keeping the curtains down. He said he hoped that meant I was sleeping well and not just blocking out the morning light. He knew the curtains were closed. That means he'd checked. That means he had walked to the specific angle in the garden that gave him a view of my windows and noted that they were now covered. And then he'd knocked on my door and told me he knew. Not as a threat, not with any edge in his voice, but as a light remark, conversational, the way you'd mention the weather. That's when I understood what had been happening all week. Not surveillance in the way you'd recognize it from a story, no cameras, no obvious watching, nothing I could point to and name cleanly. Something more ambient than that. A continuous, low-level attention. An awareness of my movements, my clothing, my curtains, my light. A presence just outside my field of vision that had been there since I arrived and that wanted, in some way I couldn't fully define, for me to know it was there. I stayed the remaining 2 nights because leaving felt like giving him a reaction he'd been building toward. I don't know if that logic was sound. It was what I had. I kept everything sealed. I used the garden gate only to leave the property entirely. I acknowledged his messages with single-word responses. I did not eat the jam. On my last morning, I thanked him briefly at checkout, and he shook my hand and said it had been a genuine pleasure and that he hoped I'd come back. He said he felt he'd gotten a sense of me over the week. A real sense, he said, like that was something to offer. I left a 3-star review. I wrote that the cottage was beautiful and the location was excellent and that I had some concerns about privacy that I'd addressed with Airbnb separately. He responded to the review publicly within an hour. Warm, gracious, expressing disappointment that I'd felt uncomfortable and saying his door was always open for a conversation. His door. As if the problem had ever been about doors. Airbnb contacted me after I flagged the messages and the pattern of behavior. They used the word monitoring in their follow-up communication, which is the closest any official language came to naming what it had actually felt like on the ground. His listing is still up. I checked recently. 67 5-star reviews now. Guests who wrote about the homemade bread, the honey from the neighbor's bees, the beautiful garden, the host's exceptional warmth. None of them mentioned the curtains. But I think about them looking up at my window in the evenings and calling it peaceful, and I wonder how many of those 67 guests had a binder clip in their bag and thought to use it. I wonder how many of them almost left a 5-star review. We went to Vermont to disappear for a week. That was the whole point. No signal, no obligations, no one who could reach us without effort. My wife and I had been running parallel lives for most of the previous year. Same apartment, different schedules, the kind of gradual drift that happens when 2 people are both too tired to address the drift. We needed to be somewhere that forced proximity. Somewhere without the escape hatch of separate screens and separate rooms and the low-grade avoidance that passes for coexistence when you're both burnt out. We found the house on a Tuesday night and booked it by Wednesday morning. A farmhouse in the Northeast Kingdom, the far northeastern corner of Vermont, The part that doesn't get written about in travel magazines because it doesn't have the ski resorts or the leaf-peeping infrastructure. It's just land. Miles of it. The listing said the nearest town was 14 miles and the nearest neighbor was 3, and both of those details felt like selling points at the time. The house was built in the 1840s. The listing mentioned it twice, almost with pride, the way people mention age when they mean character. Original wide plank floors, low door frames, windows that had been replaced once in the last century and were due for replacement again. The kitchen had been updated at some point, dishwasher, modern range, but the bones of the place were old in the way that means settled and permanent. We drove up a Friday in January, snow on the fields, the road from the main highway unpaved for the last 2 miles, and when we pulled up to the house in the early dark it looked exactly like something you'd want to disappear into. The host had left a key under a specific flagstone by the back door. Coordinates sent by message. We let ourselves in, got the wood stove going, found the bottle of local cider he'd left on the counter with a handwritten note about firewood and the generator and a phone number that would only work if we drove to the top of the hill at the north end of the property. No cell service otherwise. We'd known that. We'd wanted that. First night. Clean. We ate well, talked until late, slept heavily. The house made sounds. Old timber adjusting to the cold outside and the heat inside. A particular creak from the 3rd floorboard in the upstairs hallway that we learned to step over. Pipes somewhere in the walls doing their slow hydraulic work. Old house sounds. We both knew them. Neither of us registered them as anything other than the building's background conversation with itself. The second night I woke at 3:11 a.m. I know the time because I'd left my watch on the nightstand. I'd stopped using my phone as an alarm when we lost signal, and I checked it reflexively when I opened my eyes, the way you do when something wakes you and you're trying to orient yourself in an unfamiliar dark. The sound was coming from below the bedroom floor. A dragging sound. Slow, low, deliberate. Not the tick of a pipe or the creak of settling wood. This had lateral movement to it. Something being pulled across a surface, stone or concrete, in a single direction for 8 or 10 seconds, then stopping, then starting again from what seemed like a different position. I lay there and listened to it cycle through maybe 4 or 5 repetitions. Then it stopped entirely and didn't return. I didn't wake my wife. I lay in the dark for a while constructing explanations. An animal in the crawl space, something caught in the ductwork, a loose component in the water heater going through its cycle. All of them plausible. None of them quite fitting the quality of what I'd heard, which had a purposefulness to it that mechanical sounds don't usually have. I fell back asleep, and in the morning I didn't mention it because I didn't want to be the one who introduced unease into the trip we'd come here to repair. Third night. The same sound. 2:58 a.m. by the watch. Same floor, same direction, same periodic rhythm. I sat up this time. I put my feet on the floor. I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to it for probably 10 full minutes, tracking it, trying to map where below me it was coming from. It seemed to originate near the center of the house. Not the exterior walls, not the far end with the kitchen, but somewhere beneath the middle of the first floor. I knew there was a cellar. The listing had mentioned it. Access through a hatch in the kitchen floor, the kind of old New England root cellar that predated modern basements. The host had noted in the house manual that the hatch was stiff and required lifting at an angle, and that there was nothing down there worth seeing. Just the water heater and some old shelving. Nothing worth seeing. That phrase had meant nothing when I read it on arrival. It had the shape of nothing now too, technically. But something about hearing it again in my own head at 3 a.m. while a dragging sound moved back and forth beneath my feet made it feel like a sentence that was working slightly too hard. My wife woke up on night 4 when it started. I heard her breathing change, the specific shift from sleep breath to awake breath, and a minute later she said, quietly, into the dark, "There it is again." So she'd heard it before. She'd been doing the same thing I'd been doing. We lay there together in the dark, both awake, both listening, neither of us having said a word about it until that moment. We didn't talk about it that night. We just listened until it stopped, about 20 minutes, longer than any previous episode, and then lay in a silence that was different from the silence before it. In the morning, over coffee, we had the conversation. She'd heard it first on night 2, the same night I had. She'd constructed the same explanations. She'd made the same decision not to say anything. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table and recognized, without making it dramatic, that we'd both been quietly frightened for 2 days and had hidden it from each other out of some mutual instinct to protect the trip. That was its own kind of revelation, separate from the sound itself. I opened the kitchen hatch that afternoon. My wife sat at the table. Not out of fear, she said, but because the opening was narrow and 2 people made it awkward and someone should stay up top. I took the flashlight from the emergency kit by the back door and I went down. The cellar was low. 5 feet of clearance, maybe slightly less near the stone walls where the floor had heaved unevenly over the decades. A water heater in the far corner, a length of copper pipe running horizontally along the wall above it, 2 wooden shelving units holding mason jars with hand-labeled lids, preserves, probably left by previous guests or the host himself, a bare bulb on a pull cord that threw hard shadows into the corners. The floor was poured concrete, old, cracked in a few places, the kind of surface that would make exactly the sound I'd been hearing if something were dragged across it. Nothing had been dragged across it recently. No marks, no disturbed dust in the long-settled grime near the walls. Nothing that looked moved or displaced. But on the far wall, the wall that faced the interior of the house rather than the exterior, there was a door. Small. Not a standard interior door. Shorter and narrower, the kind of opening sized for a different era of person or a different purpose. Heavy plank construction with iron hardware that had gone completely dark with age. Padlock through a hasp. The padlock was not old. It was modern, keyed, the kind you'd buy at a hardware store for something you wanted to secure properly. I stood in front of it with the flashlight. I knocked on it twice. The sound came back dense and flat, thick wood or something packed close behind it, not an empty space. I crouched and looked at the gap under the door. Cold air came through it. Not the damp cold of the cellar, but a different quality of cold, moving air, like something with more space to travel through before it reached the gap. The space behind that door was larger than the door implied. I came back up. I told my wife what I'd found. We sat with it for a while and agreed we'd message the host, which required driving to the top of the hill for signal. His response came back in about an hour. The door, he said, led to an old root cellar that had been sealed off after a structural assessment found some instability in the walls. Padlocked for safety. The sounds we were hearing were almost certainly thermal. Old farmhouses develop pockets of pressure differential in extreme cold, especially in older foundations, and the sound of air movement through cracks in stone can carry in ways that seem directional and rhythmic. Thermal pressure. Air through stone cracks. I've read about that since. It is a real phenomenon. It exists. It does not sound like something being dragged across a concrete floor. Those are categorically different sounds, and I have ears and I know what I heard, and thermal pressure is not it. We stayed our remaining nights because the alternative was a 2-hour drive on dark, unpaved roads in January, and we'd already decided we weren't going to let the trip fail. We slept with the lamp on. We didn't go back to the cellar. The sound came again on the 6th night. Shorter than before, maybe 5 minutes, and then nothing on the 7th. I messaged the host after we were home and asked him one specific question. What was inside the root cellar? Not about the structure, not about the safety assessment. What is inside it? He never answered that question. He responded to everything around it. Thanked us for staying. Hoped the weather hadn't been too harsh. Mentioned that spring was a beautiful time to come back. He just never answered the question I asked. I've thought about why a person wouldn't answer a simple direct question about what's in a locked room under their rental property. I've thought about it from every angle I can find. I have not found an angle that makes the non-answer feel like nothing. The listing said one other person might be there. That sentence was in the 3rd paragraph of the description, tucked between a note about parking and a mention of the backyard patio. A long-term tenant occupied one of the bedrooms year-round, the host explained. Quiet, respectful, keeps to himself. Guests had their own room with a private lock, their own bathroom, access to the full kitchen and living areas. The long-term tenant was rarely home before 9 in the evening. The host had 62 reviews. The long-term tenant had never been mentioned negatively in any of them. I booked it because Austin in October during a tech conference is a hotel price nightmare, and the listing was 4 blocks from the venue, and I'd stayed in shared houses before without incident. I'm not someone who needs a space entirely to himself. I've got a decent threshold for other people's presence. Dishes in the sink, a stranger's shoes by the door, the ambient awareness of someone else's schedule. It's fine. I've done it many times. I arrived on a Sunday afternoon. The host met me at the door, early 40s, friendly, the kind of person who gives you the tour quickly and efficiently without overstaying it. He showed me my room, showed me the bathroom I'd have to myself, explained the recycling system, pointed out which shelf in the fridge was mine. He mentioned the long-term tenant almost in passing. Mid-50s, had lived there 2 years, worked irregular hours, was a private person but perfectly pleasant if our paths crossed. The host said he'd let the tenant know I was arriving. I didn't meet the tenant that evening. I went to a conference dinner, came back around 10, brushed my teeth, went to sleep. The house was quiet. I registered a light on under a door at the end of the hallway and assumed it was the tenant's room and thought nothing further. Monday and Tuesday passed without incident. The conference ran long both days. I was back at the house by 8 each evening, ate whatever I'd picked up on the way, spent an hour or 2 on email, slept. I heard movement in the kitchen once on Monday night. Footsteps, the refrigerator opening and closing, the kind of domestic sounds that mean another person lives here. I didn't get up. Felt normal. It was supposed to feel normal. Tuesday night I couldn't sleep. It wasn't anxiety, nothing specific. Just the particular restlessness of a body that's been overstimulated by 2 days of conference noise and fluorescent lighting and hasn't fully downshifted. I lay there until around 2:45 a.m. and then gave up, pulled on a sweatshirt and went downstairs for water. The kitchen was dark except for the light above the stove, which had been left on low. A habit of someone in the house, I'd noticed, a small orange glow that stayed on all night. Enough light to navigate by. I crossed to the sink, filled a glass, drank half of it standing at the counter. Then I turned around. There was a man sitting at the kitchen table. Not moving, not startled. Just sitting in the low orange light with his hands flat on the table in front of him, facing the window that looked out onto the backyard. He turned when I came around the counter. A slow, deliberate turn, like someone who'd heard me coming from the stairs and had already decided how he was going to receive me. I didn't say anything for a moment. He didn't either. Then I said hello. My voice came out even, which surprised me. He said hello back. One word. Flat. Not unfriendly but not warm. I asked if he was the other tenant. I used that word, tenant, because I didn't know his name and it was the only category I had. He said yes. We looked at each other for a second. He was younger than I'd expected from the host's description. Closer to mid-30s than mid-50s. Shaved head. A dark jacket I didn't recognize, the kind with a specific utilitarian cut. He didn't seem bothered by being found sitting alone in a dark kitchen at 2:45 in the morning. He seemed, if anything, patient, like someone who'd been waiting for the scene to proceed to its next beat. I said good night. He said good night. I went back upstairs and sat on the edge of my bed and thought about what I'd just seen. The man didn't match the description. That was the first thing. Not approximately, categorically. Mid-50s and mid-30s are not close. Gray hair and a shaved head are not close. The host had described his long-term tenant specifically enough that the mismatch wasn't a matter of vague memory or poor lighting. Something didn't line up. I messaged the host through the Airbnb platform at 6 a.m. before the conference, framing it as casually as I could manage. Mentioned I'd run into the other tenant last night, described the man I'd seen, age, appearance, the jacket, and said I just wanted to confirm everything was as expected. The host called me 40 minutes later. He said that wasn't his tenant. He said those 4 words and then there was a pause on the line where I think we were both doing the same recalibration. He asked me to describe the man again. I did. He said his tenant was 53 years old with gray hair and had told him 2 days ago he'd be visiting family for the week and wouldn't be around during my stay. His tenant wasn't in the house. If his tenant wasn't in the house, then the man I'd spoken to at 2:45 a.m. at the kitchen table had no reason to be there. No explanation. No category that made him ordinary. The host said he was coming over immediately. He said to stay in my room with the door locked. I was already dressed for the conference, already packed, already standing in the center of my room with my bag on my shoulder. I told him I'd wait on the front steps. I sat on the front steps with my rolling bag for 22 minutes. I had a full view of the street. No one came out of the house. No back door opened, no window, nothing. When the host arrived, he went through every room, every closet, the backyard, the detached garage. He called me in after about 10 minutes. The back door was unlocked. Not the deadbolt had been thrown. But the door handle had a secondary lock, a small lever mechanism just above the knob, and that one was open. The host said he always kept both locked. He was certain of it. The back door led to an alley. The police came. They took a report. They asked me to describe the man again. I'd been doing that in my head for 2 hours by that point, and I had a very clear picture. And they said without evidence of forced entry or theft or an explicit threat, there wasn't much to work with. They noted the unlocked secondary lock. They suggested changing the locks. They left. The host refunded my remaining 2 nights before I asked. He was shaken in a way that read as genuine, not defensive, not liability managing, just genuinely shaken. He said nothing like this had ever happened. He said he didn't understand how someone had gotten in. I stayed the rest of the conference in a hotel 8 blocks from the venue and paid the rate I'd originally tried to avoid. Here's what I've thought about since, because this is the part that doesn't resolve just by understanding the logistics. The man was calm. Not the surface calm of someone suppressing panic. Not the careful stillness of someone caught doing something wrong and hoping to minimize the response. Something underneath that, the kind of calm that exists when a person is exactly where they intended to be, doing exactly what they'd planned to do, unbothered by the arrival of a complication because they'd already accounted for complications. He didn't run. He didn't make an excuse. He said hello and good night like a person managing an expected variable, and then I went upstairs, and at some point after that he left through a door he'd come in through, and by the time anyone looked for him there was nothing left to find. I don't know what he was doing in the house. I don't know how long he'd been there before I came downstairs, or how many nights he'd been coming in through that back door, or whether the unlocked lever was something he'd left or something he'd found. I don't know why he was sitting at the table in the dark looking at the backyard window.
Ive constructed scenarios.
They all start with the question of what a person needs from being inside a house while its occupants sleep, and they all end somewhere I don't want to sit with for too long. What I know is the quality of his calm. The way he turned when I came around the counter, measured and unhurried, like he'd had time to prepare for that exact moment. Like he'd heard me on the stairs and organized himself before I reached the bottom. Which means he heard me leave my room. Which means he knew someone was coming down before I got there. Which means he'd been paying attention to the sounds of the house long enough to know what my footsteps on the stairs meant. I don't know how long he'd been sitting at that table. That's the part one can't put down. Not the face, not the jacket, not the unlocked door. Just the question of how long he'd been sitting there in the dark before I walked in. And whether he'd been sitting there the night before too. For the first 3 months, I thought it was over. That's the thing about this kind of situation. It doesn't announce itself as a situation while it's still forming. There's no moment where the threat declares itself and you can point to it and say, that right there, that's when it started. It assembles quietly, piece by piece, in the gaps between ordinary life, until one day you realize you've been building a dossier without knowing you were building a dossier. The stay itself was unremarkable. 3 nights in Denver in late October. I was there for a friend's wedding, solo trip, didn't need much. The rental was a 1-bedroom in Capitol Hill, clean and well located. Walking distance from the venue. The host communicated through the platform before I arrived. Check-in instructions, a note about street parking, a message the morning of my arrival asking if I'd gotten in okay. I replied that I had. He sent a thumbs up. That was the full extent of our interaction. I left a 4-star review. Not 5 because the shower pressure was genuinely poor and I believe in honest reviews. I wrote that the location was excellent, the apartment was clean, the host was responsive. I did not think about the host again after I clicked submit. In January, 11 weeks after checkout, my phone buzzed with a notification from the Airbnb app. A message from the host. I've been thinking about you. Are you well? I stared at that for a moment. My first genuine thought was that it was misdirected, that he'd meant to send it to someone else, a friend maybe, and had opened the wrong thread. People do that. I've done that. I set my phone down and went back to what I was doing and told myself it was a mistake and that he'd probably realize it within the hour. He did not send a follow-up correction. He did not send an apology for the wrong recipient. The message sat in the thread exactly as he'd sent it, singular and deliberate, for a week. Then the second one arrived. I still have something of yours. You should come back for it. I went back through every corner of my memory of that apartment. I am not a person who leaves things behind. I do a specific sweep before checkout, every room, every drawer under the bed, behind the bathroom door. I have never left anything in a rental in my life. I knew with certainty I hadn't left anything in Denver. I wrote back. I kept it factual, no warmth. What item are you referring to? He never answered that question. 3 days passed. I checked the thread twice a day without meaning to, the way you monitor something you can't quite classify as a threat but can't classify as nothing either. On the 4th day, instead of answering what I'd asked, he sent a third message. You have a way about you. I don't think you realize it. I took screenshots of all 3 messages immediately. I forwarded them to 2 friends with the host's name and the listing address. Then I opened a report with Airbnb and uploaded everything in sequence with timestamps. Airbnb suspended his account within 48 hours. A case manager contacted me with a reference number and said they were investigating. They used careful, neutral language concerning pattern of communication, terms of service violation, your safety is our priority. The kind of phrasing that tells you the situation is being taken seriously without telling you anything specific about what they know. What they knew, I found out later, was more than they said. About 6 weeks after the report, I found a thread on a travel forum. Someone had posted asking if anyone else had experienced unusual messages from a host in Denver after their stay. 3 people had replied. Not 3 people who'd had a similar vague experience. 3 people who'd received messages from the same account. Different stays, different months, same host. The first reply was from a woman who'd stayed 8 months before me. She'd received 2 messages, the first asking if she'd enjoyed Denver. The second saying he'd noticed she hadn't reviewed the stay yet and that he hoped it meant she was thinking it over carefully rather than something having gone wrong. Benign enough to dismiss. She'd dismissed it. The second reply was from a man who'd stayed about 4 months after me. He'd received 1 message, just one, that said, I kept the window the way you liked it. He didn't know what that meant. He'd never mentioned a window. He'd never communicated anything about windows. He'd reported it to Airbnb and been told the account had already been suspended. The third reply was the one that sat in me wrong for a long time afterward. A woman stayed 6 months before me. She wrote that she'd received 4 messages over the course of 2 weeks, each one slightly more personal than the last, each one referencing things about her stay that she hadn't mentioned in any communication with the host, what she'd been doing in the evenings, what she'd eaten, the general shape of her daily routine during her 3 nights there. She wrote that she'd initially tried to explain it rationally. Maybe she'd mentioned these things in passing, maybe she'd left details in a review she'd forgotten writing, maybe her memory of what she'd communicated was worse than she thought. She'd spent 2 weeks trying to find the innocent version of the explanation. Then she'd stopped trying to find the innocent version. I read her reply 3 times. Then I went back to my own 3-night stay in October and I did what I hadn't done in the 3 months since. I went through it slowly, in detail, trying to account for every hour. I'd arrived on a Thursday afternoon, dropped my bag, changed, walked to the wedding venue for the rehearsal dinner. Back around 11. Friday was the wedding, out by noon, back just after midnight. Saturday I'd slept late, walked around the neighborhood, eaten lunch at a place on Colfax, spent the afternoon reading in the apartment, gone out for dinner with the wedding group, back by 10. Here is what I could not account for. How, in 3 nights of almost no communication, the host could have developed any kind of impression of me at all. I hadn't spoken to him. I hadn't called the number on the instructions. I hadn't bumped into him at the property because there was no property overlap. The listing was self-check-in, no host on site. The only data he had about me was a booking profile, a first name, and a 4-star review that described shower pressure. You have a way about you. I don't think you realize it. Something informed that sentence. Something more than a profile photo and a rating. I don't know what it was. That's the part I've turned over the most in the years since. The most obvious explanation is a camera. A camera I didn't find because I didn't look, because the stay had felt so unremarkable that it hadn't occurred to me to check, because sometimes the absence of a reason to look is itself the mechanism. But I have no evidence of a camera. I have no evidence of anything except 3 messages and a pattern of behavior that Airbnb took seriously enough to act on immediately. What I have is the feeling of being known by someone who had no legitimate means of knowing me. And the understanding that the feeling itself, the specific discomfort of it, the way it makes you re-examine every ordinary moment of a trip you'd already closed the chapter on, was probably the point. Not a side effect. The point. That's the particular cruelty of this kind of contact. It's not just that someone says something unsettling. It's that it forces you backward into an experience you'd already processed and shelved, and it makes you dismantle it looking for the thing you missed. You spend hours on something you already spent hours on, trying to find the seam, and while you're doing that, the original event is no longer a closed memory. It's open again, active, unresolved. The thing that happened to you is happening again from the inside. I found a post this year on a different forum from a woman who'd stayed at the same listing. Long after his account was suspended, long after the investigation. She wrote that she'd just come across the forum thread and recognized the address and was trying to figure out if her experience was related. She'd stayed about a month before me. She wrote that the stay had been fine. She'd left a 5-star review. She'd never received any messages. She thought she'd gotten away clean. But she wrote that there was one thing she'd never been able to explain. On her last morning, before checkout, she'd found her suitcase moved. Not dramatically, not across the room, not opened or disturbed. Just shifted from the spot where she'd left it by the door to a position closer to the window. Overnight, while she slept. She said she'd convinced herself she'd moved it herself and forgotten. I read that and I thought about the 3 nights I'd slept in that apartment without checking a single thing. About the shower pressure review I'd written. About the 11 weeks of ordinary life between checkout and that first message. I've been thinking about you. Are you well? I think about the gap now. The silence between when something happens and when you find out it happened. That gap is where the real horror lies. Not in the message itself, not even in what it implies, but in the weeks of normal life you were living on top of it without knowing it was there. 11 weeks. I'd had 11 weeks of not knowing. I don't know how he spent those 11 weeks. I've decided I'm better off not knowing. I want to be honest about something before I tell you this. I am not a person who believes in things I cannot explain. I've never been that person. I grew up in a house where everything had a reason and reasons were expected and feelings without evidence were politely set aside. I've carried that framework my whole adult life and it has served me well. I mention this because what I'm about to describe sat badly inside that framework from the moment I found it, and it still does, and I want you to understand that when I say I don't know what it means, I mean that genuinely. Not as a hedge. Not as atmosphere. I actually do not know what it means. The rental was in New Orleans. A shotgun house in the Marigny, which is the neighborhood just downriver from the French Quarter. Narrower streets, less tourists, more locals on their porches in the evening, the sound of someone practicing trumpet drifting from a second-floor window at odd hours. I'd wanted to stay in the Marigny specifically for a long time. There's a quality to it that the Quarter has lost under the weight of its own mythology. Something that still feels lived rather than performed. I was there for 5 nights. Solo trip. Research for a writing project that had stalled and needed a change of geography to loosen it up. I had no fixed schedule. I'd go out in the mornings, walk, eat, take notes. Come back in the afternoons to write. Go out again in the evenings. Repeat. By the 3rd day, I'd settled into a rhythm that felt genuinely productive for the first time in months. The house itself was exactly right for the purpose. High ceilings, old wood floors that made their own music when you walked across them. A back porch just wide enough for a chair, and a small table where I'd sit with coffee in the mornings before the heat made it impossible. The bedroom was at the rear of the house, the way shotgun bedrooms always are. A straight line from front door to back wall, each room opening into the next with no hallway. You could stand at the front door and see all the way through to the back porch. I loved that architecture. I find it clarifying in a way I can't fully articulate. The host managed the property remotely. All communication through the platform, all logistics handled before I arrived. She had good reviews. Consistent language about cleanliness and charm and her attentiveness. Nothing unusual. I'd done my 10-minute sweep on arrival, mirrors, smoke detectors, vents, and found nothing. The house felt clean in every sense. Safe. Like somewhere something good might get written. On my last morning, I stripped the bed. The checkout instructions asked for sheets in the laundry pile near the bathroom, which I've always found a reasonable request, and I've always complied with it without complaint. I pulled the top sheet first, then the fitted sheet, folding the mattress back from the corner to work it free from the box spring. That's when I saw the notebook. It was between the mattress and the box spring, pushed toward the wall side, the side against the plaster, the side you'd never reach unless you were removing the fitted sheet and folding the mattress back from that specific corner. Could have been there for months. Could have been there for years. It was a standard black and white composition notebook, the kind that costs $2, no name or label on the cover. I want to be precise about the decision I made next, because I've thought about it many times since. I knew, with reasonable certainty, that opening it was going to show me something I couldn't unread. I knew that because of where it had been placed, not forgotten, not lost, deliberately positioned in the one location in a short-term rental where it would only be found by someone thorough enough or circumstantial enough to fold back the mattress. It had been placed there by someone who understood how rental turnovers worked and had chosen accordingly. I opened it anyway. The entries were handwritten. Different hands in different places. Some of the handwriting neat and deliberate, some loose and hurried, some so cramped it took me a moment to parse. Dated entries spanning what looked like 3 years from the first page to about 2/3 through. The remaining third was blank. The early entries were ordinary. Someone describing their first night in New Orleans, the heat, the sound of the neighborhood, how different it was from wherever they'd come from. Someone else writing about the food, the way beignet sugar gets on everything, a second-line parade they'd stumbled into on a Sunday. Reading them felt like trespassing in the most minor possible way, private thoughts that were private for no particular reason except that they were someone's and not mine. Then I turned to an entry about 1/3 of the way through, undated, handwriting I hadn't seen before, smaller, more careful, the letters formed with a precision that suggested someone who'd thought about penmanship at some point in their life. It said, "The house sounds different at 3 a.m. Not like settling. More like attention." I stopped on that line. Read it again. More like attention. The next entry from the same hand, a few pages later. I keep thinking someone is standing just outside the edge of where I can see. I turn and there's nothing. I've turned maybe 30 times today. I'm going to stop counting. 3 entries after that, different handwriting, someone who'd clearly stayed months later. I don't want to write this down because writing it makes it real. Something was in the doorway last night. Not a shape exactly. A quality of the dark that was different from the dark around it. I watched it for a long time. It didn't move. I sat on the edge of the stripped mattress and read for probably 40 minutes. There were 9 or 10 distinct voices in that notebook across the 3 years. I counted the handwriting styles the way you'd count speakers in a conversation. Not all of them described anything unusual. Some entries were pure travelogue, pure delight. People who'd clearly loved the house and the city and had used the notebook the way you'd use a guest book. A few pages were drawings, the view from the back porch, a rough sketch of the street outside, the interior of the main room rendered in careful pencil lines. But scattered through the 3 years, from multiple different hands in multiple different stays, there was a thread. The sense of being observed. The doorways. The quality of the dark. The corners of rooms that felt occupied in ways they shouldn't. One person wrote about waking in the night and lying absolutely still, convinced with total certainty that someone was sitting in the chair in the corner, and then the light coming on and the chair being empty and the certainty not leaving anyway. And then, near the back, 8 or 9 pages from the end, written in handwriting that was different from everything before it. Larger, looser, as if written in a hurry or in low light or both. She came into the room again last night. I don't think she's malicious. I just think she's curious about us. No date. No context. No follow-up entry from the same hand. I sat with that sentence for a long time. I am not a person who believes in things I cannot explain. I said that at the start and I mean it now as much as I meant it then. But I will tell you what I noticed, sitting on that stripped mattress in a shotgun house in the Marigny with that notebook in my hands. I had been checking corners the entire stay. Every room, Every time I entered, a reflexive scan of the corners and the doorways. I'd registered it as a habit, something left over from the 10-minute sweep I do at every rental, a residual alertness. Normal, professional caution. Except it wasn't that. I checked corners in my own apartment when I got home. I didn't check them before New Orleans. Whatever had activated that reflex had activated it inside that house, in those 5 days, without my consciously noticing it was happening. Someone in that notebook, a stranger, a different year, a different stay, had written, "I've turned maybe 30 times today." I understood exactly what they meant. I understood it from the inside. I placed the notebook back between the mattress and the box spring. Exactly where I'd found it, same position, same orientation. I pressed the mattress back into place and finished stripping the sheets and left them in the pile by the bathroom and checked out on time. I have thought many times about whether I should have taken it. Whether there's someone out there who stayed in that house and wrote in that notebook who deserves to know that someone else read what they wrote. Whether the notebook itself is evidence of something or just the accumulated impressions of tired travelers in an old house that has strong atmospheric bones and poor corner lighting. I don't have a clean answer to any of that. What I have is this. 5 nights in a house that felt completely right and completely safe and produced in me, without my awareness, a habit of checking corners that I did not have before I arrived and did not fully shed for weeks after I left. The host's listing is still active. Still 5 stars. Still that same description, charming, historic, steps from all the best the Marigny has to offer. I've thought about going back. Not to stay. Just to check if the notebook is still there. To see if the blank pages at the back have been filled in. I haven't gone back. But I think about the blank pages. I think about them more than I probably should. That's 10 stories. 10 rentals, 10 people, 10 things that didn't stay behind when the trip ended. If any part of what you heard tonight felt familiar, if you recognized a moment, a feeling, a detail you've never fully explained to yourself, drop it in the comments. This channel exists because these stories deserve to be told out loud. Subscribe to Bleak Fears if you're new here. Turn the notifications on. And the next time you check into a rental, check the corners.